So in talking about the dental infection evolution and how we choose antibiotics that are appropriate for it, we choose the one that's appropriate to the stage of evolution. And again, a practitioner with a lot of experience knows how to treat these things, okay? We know that in the beginning we're talking about gram-positive cocci, and penicillin or amoxicillin is going to be your drug of choice unless the patient is allergic to it. Penicillin actually does have a narrow spectrum, and by spectrum I mean what? What it can destroy, okay? So I always think of spectrum like a light spectrum, right? We think like a rainbow sort of thing. So if you think of a narrow spectrum, okay, it doesn't have an effect of on a lot of different bacteria, but what's great is that they do match the types of bacteria that are involved in those early dental infections. If the patient's allergic, we then usually go to something like erythromycin or clindamycin. Those would be our next choices, okay? In later stages, we should actually know what the bacteria are, what the organisms are. We should identify them and know what the proper antibiotic should be to apply to it. Again, now looking back on something like penicillin, penicillin literally changed the course of our history. Okay, it literally changed the course of our history. It wasn't until 1928 that Alexander Fleming observed that a mold that he had growing in a petri dish actually started to go away because there was the mold started to grow in a petri dish that had bacteria growing, and there started to be a clear area in it because it inhibited the growth of bacteria. It was really quite by accident that this happened. They then took this and kind of ran with it, and it was a little bit later, Ernst Chain and Howard Florey then isolated that penicillin, and they used it to treat infections for soldiers in World War II. Okay, so I know that seems like a long time ago to you, but in terms of the course of history, it's a very, very short period of time. Okay, it wasn't very long ago. And then it was released to the market in the 1940s. So this is something that literally changed lives. I remember reading some statistics on the Civil War and the First World War, but particularly the Civil War, that more people died of infection than from the actual wounds themselves. So they would have lived if we had something like penicillin. And there was this poster that was put out as, thanks to penicillin, he will come home. Your soldier will come home because we've now learned how to treat infection. So again, life and history altering discovery. So today, unfortunately, we've kind of gone to the other end of the spectrum. You ever heard that saying that the pendulum swings too far the other way? You know, like, so we were over here with nothing, and now we're like over here, like treating everything with it, and we need to have some sort of balance. So the indiscriminate use of antibiotics has reduced their effectiveness against a lot of bacteria because the bacteria are becoming stronger. We have totally resistant strains of bacteria. In institutions like hospitals, they have strains of bacteria that literally hang out there, okay, waiting to infect people that are immunocompromised. That's kind of what's happening, unfortunately, because we don't have a way of killing them. So knowing what the infective process is and applying the correct treatment to it is absolutely critical. I did, as I said, I did put some of these definitions in here for you, and I just wanted to review a few of them. So the anti-infective word is a very general term. Antibacterial means it's going to treat bacteria. Antibiotics, the word is actually reserved for those chemical drugs, those substances that are produced by bacteria themselves. Really interesting. They're produced by microorganisms, okay? And they have the capacity in dilute solutions, so they're not toxic, to destroy or suppress the growth of organisms or multiplication, so either kill it or keep it from growing, or prevent the action that they have. So again, pretty incredible. Antimicrobials, now when we talk about rinsing with chlorhexidine, we call that an antimicrobial rinse. It's not an antibiotic rinse because it destroys or suppresses the growth or multiplication of those organisms in the mouth using a rinse. Antifungals and antivirals we talked about last week. They have specific action against fungi or against viruses. And then importantly, when we talk about the drugs, the antibiotics that we're going to talk about, bactericidal kill bacteria, and it's irreversible. They've killed off those bacterial cells. Bacteriostatic, while the drug is present, they suppress the growth of the drug, and then when you remove them, the bacteria can start growing again. Okay, so that's periostatic. You know, static keeps something stable, you remove it, and they start growing again. It is reversible. And if you use it, and you wonder, like, why does the bacteriostatic one work? Because if you use it long enough, it kills off enough of the bacteria to put our bodies back in balance, okay? The blood or serum level is going to be the concentration in the blood, and usually we look for a certain level of concentration in order to effectively treat an infection. And a certain level is required to kill off certain types of bacteria, and we work to get the drug into the system, particularly for systemic infections, so that it's at that therapeutic level, if you will. Infection is invasion of pathogenic microorganisms into tissue, okay? And then it's also the reaction of the tissue. So you get the microorganisms there, and then you get the influx of, you know, the white blood cells, and then you get the heat, and you get the redness, and you get the swelling, and all of that. So again, remember that these pathogens are often there, particularly when we talk about places like our mouth. But if they get out of balance, we can then get an infection. Or an injury, we can get an infection. And when we talk about the minimal inhibitory concentration, that would be the lowest amount that we need, and that's what we're going for, the lowest amount that we need for the shortest period of time in order to treat an infection, okay? And resistance is the ability of a bacteria to resist our efforts to kill it, okay? And they do have a way of becoming resistant. If they're not resistant to begin with, they can acquire the resistance, and we'll talk about the different ways that happens. Spectrum, we already talked about, is the range of activity. That's another way of looking at it, of a drug. It may be narrow, may be intermediate, or it may be broad, okay? And we try to go narrow to treat a specific infection, but when we don't have the reaction that we need in killing off an infection, you may have to go to a broader antibiotic, but that should be second choice. Superinfection, also called supra infection, is caused by a proliferation of microorganisms, usually when you've killed off some of the other ones. So this would go into play when when someone comes off an antibiotic and then they wind up with a fungal infection, right? So you have somebody taking an antibiotic for a long period of time and they wind up with a fungal infection, okay? So we may actually cause an infection by suppressing one thing and causing the overgrowth of another. And you've heard of people having viruses or having a cold or something and then having a super infection, bacterial infection, that then needs to be treated with an antibiotic at another stage when you just don't get rid of it.
Professor,
Yeah?
with that kind of infection happen with a broad
More often it's going to happen with a broad spectrum, right? Because you're killing off more bacteria, especially with the bacteria. If you put a broad spectrum antibiotic on someone, you kill off so much of the flora, so you kill the good bacteria and the bad bacteria, right? GI distress, vaginal yeast infection, you know, thrush, lots of things that happen like that. So that's definitely more susceptible with a broad spectrum, for sure. Okay, when we talk about things being synergistic, and we're going to talk about this with a lot of drugs, I'm surprised we haven't run into this word before, is that we know sometimes that two things working together, when we say that the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of two parts, right? So you take one thing and you take another, and they have an additive effect, but when they're taken together, they have an even better effect in working together. So that's, when we combine them, they can be synergistic, okay? They can also fight each other too. So they can antagonize each other as well, like using a bacteriostatic and a bactericidal one at the same time. Sometimes that's done on purpose, and sometimes not. It's kind of a general way of doing it. So 1 + 1 in this case would be less than 2, whereas 1 + 1, when they're synergistic, can be greater than 2. And again, we will know the combinations that do this when you're someone that treats these things all the time. When we talk about an infection, this is really important. There are several different factors that are going to determine how strong is that infection, okay? And how likely we are to have an infection. And that's going to be the disease-producing power of the microorganism. How strong is it? Is it a resistant bacteria? Is it that staph infection in that hospital that they haven't been able to kill off, okay? So how strong is that bacteria? The number of organisms present, right? You think the more they are and the stronger they are, definitely. And probably the most important, that somehow we put third here, is going to be how resistant am I, the host, to that infection? Because we fight off infection constantly. I love that video of that gentleman, which is why I even showed it, even though we're not talking about viruses today, because you can see that he's being attacked by all of these millions of viruses that grew from one cell. And the host asked him, why doesn't the guy just drop dead? Look at those millions of viruses that are forming. Because we have a way of fighting this infection. We fight it constantly, okay? Person sitting next to you sneezing and coughing all over, and you're thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna get sick, okay? Sometimes we do, lots of times we don't, because we have a way of fighting it. And we know the more tired and the more stressed out we are, that our immune response will go down, which is why a lot of us wind up getting sick in the middle of this semester, okay, unfortunately. So the resistance of the host is really important. How healthy are we at that time? Are we fighting some other kinds of diseases or infection? Do we have systemic disease? All of those kinds of things. So one of the ways that we attack this, which I've alluded to already, is a way to ensure correct therapy is going to be culturing and sensitivity of the organisms themselves. And again, your book doesn't go into it as much detail as it used to, but I know you guys are familiar with it, and we do this in dentistry, so I wanted you to know about it. So sensitivity testing would be exposing the organism to test which antibiotic is going to be more effective against it. And there are labs which do this. You can culture and you can send these things away. So that would help us to decrease the resistance and increase the effectiveness of the antibiotic that's very specific for those kinds of bacteria. And again, sometimes we'll throw a broad spectrum antibiotic at a person that we can't seem to get a handle on, but mostly we want to do it very sensitively. As you can see here, that's actually a paper point which is put into an infection, and we will then do anaerobic culturing by going into like a very deep pocket or into a pustule that's formed from a dental infection, and we will then put that onto a slide. There are little kits you can get and send that off. In some offices, they actually put them under a microscope and look at them. So indications for that would be serious infection, a patient who's compromised, so we can put the right drug in place, or if that person has been non-responsive to treatment, we may culture so that we can then be much more effective in what we're doing. Collecting the bacteria must be done in a very reliable way in order to get good results. They do gram staining. Do you guys remember the pink and the purple and all? Gram positive, gram negative, and when we talk about that, we're talking about that type of staining. So gram positive bacteria have very thick walls, so they retain the purple stain, okay? So something like staph and strep, okay? When we do the strep test, that's what they're doing, okay? Gram-negative have thin walls. They tend to be that pinker, lighter color because they don't have those thick cell walls, and they don't pick up the gram staining as much. And that will help determine the susceptibility of those specific bacteria to the antibiotics. So here's a question for you. For an early stage dental infection, I've already alluded to this a little bit, the antibiotic of choice would be penicillin. Very good. We did talk about that. It's pretty easy to remember. For an early stage dental infection, if the patient is allergic to penicillin or those classes, the antibiotic choice could be erythromycin, amoxicillin, clindamycin, cephalosporin, B and D, A and C. A and C, good job. So that would be F. You were listening. So when you ask me what drugs do I need to know, if I ask you questions about them and I cover them a lot, those are the drugs you need to know, okay? And I will tell you. They're important, and they're important to what we do every day. So again, resistance is something we're going to talk about a lot. They estimate that there are 2 million cases and 23,000 deaths per year in the United States alone. That's huge. There are naturally resistant microorganisms, okay? They're naturally very strong, okay? That's part of the bacteria's normal properties. There's acquired resistance, so one that was previously susceptible to the antibiotic now develops resistance against it, and that happens in several different ways. The longer an antibiotic is in use, the more repeated and proper use of that antibiotic, when we're constantly throwing it on things, the more likely it's going to develop resistance to infective microorganisms. So those ones we use all the time, indiscriminately, okay? So this is a huge issue for individuals. It's a huge issue for institutions that now have these superbugs, okay? So we reduce this by prescribing only when necessary and for the shortest course. And when I say the shortest course, it doesn't mean people take it till they feel better. They take the whole prescription, but for the shortest course of time that's known to be effective against it. So what causes bacteria that used to be susceptible to the antibiotic and die, okay, or at least stop growing, acquired resistance. And that can happen because the organism can mutate. Lovely, kind of like viruses do, right? It adapts. We're all adaptable. Okay, that's why we grew to be who we are, these evolved human beings. Living beings adapt, and they adapt to the fact that they're getting attacked by these antibiotics and they become stronger. They can also transfer their DNA to other microorganisms that weren't normally resistant to the antibiotic. It's amazing, okay? So that results in decreased permeability of the cell wall, enzyme production which breaks down the antibiotic, okay? And the target site is altered, and the binding of the antibiotic is blocked to that drug, okay? And you can see this better when you look at it, but they show a bunch of bacteria, and there's one resistant little bacteria there. That little guy's resistant. It gets bathed in antibiotics, okay? And normally those other bacteria die. But the resistant one sends out its DNA, okay? And makes the other ones become resistant to it, okay? And the entire infection now involves the resistant strain, which will no longer die from the antibiotic, okay? Those mean little buggers. Okay. What are the indications then for these antibiotics? I seem to be against, I'm not against, but they should be used discriminately because there's a lot of controversy about it, okay? We know that they can be used therapeutically, right, to treat an infection, or prophylactically in a preventive way, right? So we're talking about people with heart and joint issues, which we'll talk about in a little while. Okay, when should we use those as discriminately as possible? So therapeutically in dentistry, we have to consider several things that we've already talked about if we're going to be using an antibiotic, and if we see somebody present with this thing that the common name for it used to be a gum boil, if you will, okay, but an abscess that has percolated its way to the outside of the mouth there. We look first at the patient themselves. We've taken their medical history, we know what other drugs they're taking, we know if they've been going through chemotherapy, we know if they're a healthy person, okay? If they're not immunocompromised, okay, and drainage can be obtained, we do not need an antibiotic. You're gonna get that question over and over again. If drainage can be established and the patient is immunocompetent, they're competent, right, immunologically, they're not immunocompromised, we do not use an antibiotic. Then we consider the infection itself. How virulent is it? How strong is it? How widespread is it? Is it acute? Did it just happen and is it rapidly spreading? Oh my goodness, we may need a prescription. If it's mild, if it's localized, and we're able to drain it, we do not need one.